Hello and welcome to my Chessable Move Trainer course on the Najdorf. In this video chapter we will be dealing with the most popular, currently I would say, move Bishop G5 on move 6. So after e4, c5, knight f3, d6, d4, cd, knight d4, knight f6, knight c3, a6, bishop g5. This has been considered the traditional main line in the Najdorf. I believe this is the case because in the 50s and maybe even earlier, when the Najdorf was slowly becoming more and more popular, this was the most often played move, and it involved some really spectacular, historically famous games, and ever since then it was considered as one of the most critical tests for the Najdorf. The move itself, very similar to the rouser, which arises after knight c6 instead of a6, creates the positional threat of bishop f6. So immediately black is faced with the choice what to do about it. Honestly, I was not sure what to recommend against bishop g5. I was thinking very hard what to do, the main choice being immediately now, because apart from the, again, traditionally most natural move e6, in the last several years the move knight bd7 rose to prominence, and I would say currently it is equally popular as the move e6. This move was considered inferior in the 50s and even 60s. There was this famous win by Boris Spassky against Tigran Petrosyan in their second match, which basically clinched the title for Spassky. A very beautiful, quick win with white. And ever since those times, it was considered an inferior move. But recently, new ideas have been discovered for black. And the line is very, very much alive, and white is having serious problems trying to show something against it. Eventually, I decided against knight bd7. The reason? Well, because in many lines, the idea of knight d7 is to follow up with g6, sometimes including h6 and so on, and then bishop g7. So in a way, this was a mixture of some dragon ideas, which I thought are a bit less Najdorf-like, if you would. So, having made my choice to stick with the true Najdorf style play with e6, I was then faced with the next choice, which line to choose after the most critical move, f4. And my choice fell on the so-called improved poisoned pawn variation arising after h6, bishop h4, queen b6. The reason for this were Vachier-Lagrange's successes in this line, and I think that I could even say that he's single-handedly responsible for the popularity and resurrection of this line. Again, this line is not new. It was also famous in the 50s, for example, but it was considered inferior. But then again, Vachier just, with his analytical work and practical successes, discovered new ways for black and successfully established the line as a very solid and reliable one for black. So, before embarking on the theory, final note, this line of bishop g5 is one, together with the Sozin, one that requires the most memorization of concrete lines. So, even though I have tried to explain the concepts, describe and try to explain the positions so that you can understand them, in some cases it's simply inevitable to memorize exactly the move orders and the forcing lines that need to be remembered. After all, it is the Najdorf, and this is inevitable. So, of course, f4 is the critical move. However, there are alternatives. Queen f3 is the main alternative. it does not really create the threat of bishop f6, because after bishop f6, queen f6, queen x6, gf6, the endgame is favorable for black. Great control of the center and the bishop pair. However, the idea of queen f3 is to castle one move faster, having avoided the f4 move, and then create some play in the center against black's king, as the f4 pawn can later be included in the game by moving the queen to g3 or h3 and then pushing f4. Against queen f3, long time ago, I prepared an interesting and rare line, which I will show you now, and it starts with the move knight bd7. Obviously, bishop e7 is a valid alternative, but queen a5 is a bit premature. Queen a5 will follow on the next move, especially as it loses the pawn to bishop f6. So knight d7 actually prepares the move queen a5, and it was my preparation from a very long time ago. Of course, ever since then I checked the line with an engine and made sure that it is still reliable and good. So long castle and now queen a5. So what's the idea? Well, black is hitting the g5 bishop, taking advantage of the fact that it's not defended by f4, removes the queen from the pin, and also prepares for possible b5. I say possible because the immediate b5 is bad, because after e5 both the knight on f6 and the rook on a8 are hanging. So queen a5, bishop, okay, h4 first. So white does not want to retreat the bishop just yet, but after h6 he is forced to do so. Okay, bishop d2, again trying to win tempo against the queen, and now queen c7. So what did black achieve? He eventually ended up with the comfortable move queen c7, but at the same time managed to force the bishop back from the aggressive g5 square, and now black is ready to continue with b5. Remember that with the queen on c7, b5 is possible because e5, the threat of e5, can be comfortably met by bishop b7 hitting the queen. Also, the queen on c7 covers the c6 square and also allows b5. And from here, black's play is relatively straightforward. b5, possibly b4, rook, bishop b7, maybe knight comes to e5, maybe to c5. He will see whether bishop e7 is required, because, for example, if the queen goes to g3, then g7 may hang, so the bishop may have to remain on f8. But then, also the modern treatments see the viability of moves like h5, stopping white's g4, and a typical knight of dynamically complex middle game ensues, where black's chances are at least equal. The alternatives are a bit less critical. For example, queen d3 can be met by b5 immediately. The point being that the queen from f3 impeded b5, but on d3 this is already possible. b5 and then possibly b4, quickly bishop b7 hitting e4 with very direct knight of counterplay in the center. For some reason, the move b5 turned out to be a bit of a problem move. I assume some students have confused the lines a bit by playing queen b6, which in this case is simply useless because white castles long, defends the b2 pawn, and gets the king to the queen side. So there is no f4, so no point in playing queen b6. While queen a5 again is sort of a mix-up of the lines. That one worked in the queen f3 line after knight bd7, but here not really, because white can follow up with f4. And also the knight c6 move, which is perfectly fine, theoretically very decent one, but one that transposes to the Rouser variation. So it is a possible move, but it just leaves knight of territory. I still prefer b5 with the typical knight of play by bishop b7, b4, knight d7, rook c8, and so on. The worst of the 7th move alternatives for white is the move queen d2. Why so? Because after the move h6, important move, white is forced to give up the dark squared bishops without any compensation. So, if bishop h4, then knight f4, knight e4 is a typical trick. You can figure out the complications yourself, but it's working just fantastic for black. So don't forget this typical trick whenever the bishop is undefended on h4. Bishop e3, the bishop again will be lost after knight g4 because it can't go to f4 because of e5. And obviously taking on f6, queen f6 is great for black, who won the bishop pair without any concession. So queen d2 is basically a dubious move after, especially because of h6. So having dealt with the alternatives, let's turn our attention to the critical f4. And now we follow in Vachier's footsteps by playing h6 first. This is the start of the improved poisoned pawn variation. Let me try to explain why this became popular and why it's more reliable than the, you could say, the direct poisoned pawn with queen b6. The reason for this is that after h6, bishop h4, queen b6, all the lines that are normally dangerous and possible in the poisoned pawn, which are queen d2 and queen d3, work so much better for black thanks to the inclusion of h6. So h6 bishop h4 allows, as we will see in the analysis, allows black better options in the complications in case white sacrifices on b2. So this was the main reason why, actually, I would say discovery of Vachier or his analytical team. This discovery that h6 vastly helps black in the poisoned pawn variations when black takes on b2 was the principal reason for the resurrection of the improved, you could say, poisoned pawn variation. The drawback, obviously, is that white is not forced to enter those complications. So, theoretically, the most important move is the move a3, which indirectly defends the b2 pawn thanks to the threat of knight a4 trapping the queen. This has been known since the 50s, as I mentioned. If I remember correctly, there was a nice game between Keres and Benko from the 1959 candidates in Yugoslavia involving this a3 move. So the move has been known since the 50s, but the new the discoveries that Vachier made, how black should develop and how should continue in the middle game, made this line popular again. So before entering the analysis of the principled move a3, now let's first see why is the h6 move so important in the lines where white sacrifices the pawn on b2 in the typical fashion after queen d2 or queen d3. Please note that the inclusion of h6 makes the move knight b3 basically a blunder, because queen e3 wins a pawn, either the one on f4 or the one on e4. So queen d2, queen b2, and now rook b1. Immediately should be noted that the other typical and one of the main lines in the normal poisoned pawn, knight b3, here is just bad because exactly because of the inclusion of h6, bishop h4. The point being that after bishop e7, this move creates the immediate threat of knight e4, and all this thanks to the undefended position of the bishop on h4. So the move knight b3 created the threat of a3 and then trapping the queen by rook a2, but now this is parried by the move knight e4. White's best here is to take on f6, and after taking off 6, the knight on c3 is hanging, so now knight a4. The queen is almost trapped, there is only one square to go to, queen a3, and now knight b6. It may appear that white is doing all right, because it appears that he'll win material, because he will take on a1, and then there is a double attack on c8, a8. But if we continue the line, a forcing line, bishop a1, knight a1, and now queen c5, an important move, knight a8, b6, we see the whole point. Temporarily, black is a piece down, but the knight on a8 is not getting out of a8 alive. Maximum it can do is to take a pawn, but then the ensuing position will be favorable for black. Simplified position, but much better for black because of the better structure. The pawns on a2 and c2 will make his defense rather difficult. Additionally, also, the king does not find it really easy to castle short because of the strong position of the queen on c5. So immediately, one of the main ideas in the poison pawn, the line with knight b3, is practically refuted thanks to the inclusion of h6. Therefore, if white wants to sacrifice, he is forced more or less to go rook b1, and after queen a3, now there are several options white can choose from. The most critical is the one that is also the most critical currently in the normal poison pawn, the move e5. But we should also check the alternatives as well. f5 is another popular line in the poison pawn, but here, again, thanks to the inclusion of h6, bishop h4, black is doing great thanks to the tactical trick knight e4 that we saw as a possibility in the previous line. So bishop e7. Again, threatening knight e4. In the normal poison pawn without the inclusion of h6, bishop h4, the main move is knight c6. But here bishop e7 is much better because it immediately creates the threat of knight e4. f e6, and now f e6. This is an important moment. It is important because it can easily be confused with the identical line with white queen being on d3. So instead of queen d2, queen d3, then queen b2, rook b1, queen a3, f5, bishop e7, f e6. So we have the same position with the queen on d2 and a queen on d3. And the reaction, black's reaction, is different. Now, let me explain. With the queen being on d2, the bishop on f1 is not restricted and it can come to c4. That means that if in this position black takes with the bishop on e6, after knight e6, f e6, bishop c4 will attack the pawn on e6. Therefore, in this case, black takes with a pawn. Consequently, and I will explain this again when we look at the queen d3 line, with the queen on d3, the bishop cannot come to c4 and attack the pawn, so black can take on e6 with the bishop, simplifying the position after knight e6, f e6. This is the main distinction. So, let's continue. f e6, bishop c4. So white is again trying to put pressure on e6, and it would be very uncomfortable if not for the tactical trick knight e4, which I spoke of. The line is now forced, but relatively easy to not only remember but also figure out over the board if required. Knight e4, bishop h4 check, g3. The bishop is hanging, so bishop g5. Obviously, black must continue with the forcing moves because white's development advantage is rather big, and he may start just attacking or just start by simply taking on e6. So bishop g5. Bishop g5 also contains a hidden tactical idea which is critical for black's successful navigation of these complications. So it's forced to take knight g5, hg, and now knight e6. It appears crushing, but black is saved by this hidden tactical idea which I mentioned. Before seeing the tactical idea, let's see what happens if white castles. It also appears very threatening, but then the important move is queen c5, not only centralizing the queen, but attacking the bishop, but also pinning the knight, so thus preventing a possible knight e6 captures. So queen f2, the threat is to give the check, but that check is not dangerous, because after knight c6, black is actually forcing the exchange of queens. As usual in these lines, black is actively seeking simplifications, because he's both up in material and very frequently he's better positionally, thanks to the better structure. These pawns on a2 and c2 make every endgame for white at least tricky. So black is always seeking simplification. So knight c6. This forces the exchange of queens, because queen f7 is just one check after king d8. White loses material. There are no more threats, and he will lose a piece. So knight e6, but now after the exchange of queens and exchange on e6, we have at least an equal endgame. Black is still a pawn up, but white's activity should suffice for returning of the material. Now the simplest move is rook b8, simply defending the pawn. And now, if white is not vigilant, probably he should play something like bishop d5, and then when the knight moves, take on b7 with equal material and most likely a drawn endgame. In any case, black's idea is to put a knight on the untouchable e5 square, from where it will definitely not be inferior to the bishop. And then the king can come to e7, centralizing. Then the rook from h8 can go to c8, maybe attack c2. There are ideas like g4, knight f3, and so on. I would say that even though the position should objectively be a draw, it is white who should be a bit more careful, because black's position is more compact. So, going back to the position instead of white's short castle, what happens after knight e6? The knight is very strong, so must be taken. And again, this looks devastating, because b7 is hanging, the queen can enter the attack via g5, short castle, and so on. But the tactical trick, which you should remember, or if not remember, then discover over the board, that makes sure that black is safe, is the very nice move, queen g3. Very, very nice move. The point being that after hg, check, white cannot avoid losing the queen. So, king moves, another check, king moves, rook d2, king d2, and now black is 2 pawns up, but his pieces are still not defended, so most likely he will lose one, but then will remain with another one up. Unfortunately, that extra pawn will with this double g pawn, so white will most likely make a draw. So after rook a7, defending the pawn, bishop d5, knight d7. Unfortunately, b5 will not save the pawn, because after a4, well, white will most likely get it back. So after knight d7, probably things will get exchanged on b7. The knight will come to c5, defending a6 and attacking the bishop on b7. The king will be centralized. Theoretically speaking, black is still a pawn up, but this pawn is doubled, so most likely this will end in a draw. But obviously, black will be the one who will be at least try to press for a while. So this shows that the line with f5, very popular, it used to be very popular, at least in the poison pawn, with the regular poison pawn, is easily dealt with thanks to this bishop e7 move and the tactical trick knight e4. Another attempt for white here is the positional approach, bishop f6. White basically lost the tempo, having played bishop h4, bishop f6. But since black will soon be forced to play h5 himself, to prevent the maneuver bishop e2, bishop h5, we basically have a direct transposition to the regular lines of the poison pawn. So gf, bishop e2, and now h5. An important move. Bishop e2 created the positional threat of bishop h5. The bishop, if allowed, the bishop h5 will be very annoying for black. It will pin down black to the defense of the f7 pawn. It may introduce some threats based on knight e6, especially if that pawn will require defense. And also it prevents the black bishop from being perhaps defended by bishop h6. Therefore, an automatic reaction to bishop e2 should be the move h5. Some students have confused things a little bit by playing the move queen a5. Now, the move queen a5 is played on the next move. However, here it's not good, because after queen a5, white has knight b3, effectively removing the queen from the fifth rank and allowing bishop h5. So, once understood that queen a5 does not prevent bishop h5, it's easy to make the move h5 immediately. And after castle, now queen a5. It is possible to start with knight c6, which is fine, as some students have done, even though the moves like queen c5 and bishop e7 are not the most precise here. So, queen a5. It in a way limits the movement of the knight on c3 by pinning it down. From the fifth rank, the queen is quite actually effective, and a good square for the queen can be the e5 square. So after f5, queen e5, the queen can find herself quite comfortable on e5, from where it cannot be attacked, especially as this knight will be on d4 will be exchanged after knight c6. It can't be attacked there, and it defends e6 comfortably and f6, and also eyes a bit the h2 pawn. I remember I won a very nice and important game in a junior championship in 1992 with this idea. After knight c6, bc6, f5, the queen went to e5, I pushed d5 and then bishop d6. And it was very nice and important game I won back then, in a short number of moves too. So king h1, normal move, useful move, getting the king out of the diagonal without the dark squared bishop. White is more sensitive on the dark square, so it makes sense to remove the king. And now knight c6. Apart from being a pawn up, black is also seeking simplifications, in particular the knight on d4, which is white's most active piece. No really choice for white in order not to waste the tempo by removing the knight, because removing it won't improve it. It's best to take, and now centralize the queen by queen d4. This attacks f6 and also eyes the b6 square. As you can see, here it plays positional. As I mentioned, bishop f6 line is the positional approach for white in the poisoned pawn, where white is not really trying to attack and immediately prove his compensation for the pawn by attacking the king or creating some wild complications, but rather he's trying to use the better mobility and better development of his pieces, seeking positional compensation. And he does this by targeting the weaknesses on the queen side, especially the b6 square. So the idea now is knight a4, knight b6. Bishop e7 must be played because the pawn was hanging, and now knight a4. If you look at the position, that's the only active plan white has, because playing in the center is useless. Black is so solid there that nothing can really work. So the only idea is to try to use the b6 square for some sort of penetration there, or creating some activity. And now d5. e5 would be a mistake, as some students have tried, because of the move queen c4. And then c6 is kind of difficult to defend, because bishop d7 can be met either by knight b6 or rook b7. So, while these students have understood the importance to play in the center, unfortunately they moved the wrong pawn. Why d5? d5 opens also the diagonal of the bishop for the bishop on e7, and this also allows, perhaps for some ideas later on, as we will see, for the queen to connect with the bishop and defend it via from a3 or c5 perhaps. So d5, white continues with knight b6, hitting the rook, rook b8, knight c8, rook c8, f5. So now we have opposite colored bishops, and what white is trying to do is trying to open up the position against black's king, even though this is difficult to achieve, especially after e5. But by putting the pawns on light squares, he's trying to provoke black's pawns to be removed from the light squares, because black's pawns on light squares limit the movement of white's bishop. So what white is trying to do is trying to attack these pawns, for example e5, and ideally if he manages just to provoke black into playing d4, that would transform the bishop on e2 from being a limited one to a wonderful piece when it comes to c4. And then the black's material advantage would be insignificant because the bishop would be dominating the position. So, for the time being, yes, black is trying to keep the position close by playing e5, but he will not, probably never, play d4, because that would liberate the bishop on e2. So, queen a7, trying to come to b7 and exert pressure along the 8th rank, and now king f8. Ideally, the king would like to hide on g7, which is a pretty safe square. Don't be afraid that something can happen on the g file, because the simple move h4 covers the g3 square, so the king will be safe there. Apart from this long-term strategic idea of king g7, the king is removed so that if required, the rook can come to e8 to defend the bishop on e7. After rook b7, rook e8, we have a very peculiar position, I would say, because even though black seems tied down to the defense of the bishop on e7 and being pinned along the 7th rank because f7 is hanging, it is difficult for white to increase his pressure. So the question now for white is how to continue. Whereas black, being safely defended here with the rook on e8 and king on f8, everything being safe, still has a free queen and rook to play with. So the queen may be threatened to, will threaten to take on a2. Another idea is to go h4, h3, weakening the position of white's king. When the pawn is removed from h5, the rook can enter the game via g8, hitting maybe g2. The move d4 should be carefully considered because it allows the bishop to come out to c4, but that is something to be considered. And also there is the positional idea of queen c5, trying to force an exchange of queens. So, even though black is visually pinned down, you can see that actually he has quite a few active possibilities at his disposal, whereas it's not quite clear what white should be striving for here and how to increase his activity. So the positional approach is the least forcing one of the three options white has on move 11, but also one that can, as you could see, be easily dealt with. Let's now see what happens after e5. e5, d5. You could say automatic reply d5, because after fe5, this pawn on e5 can often turn out to be either weak or can be attacked. And now a major choice is in front for black. He has three theoretically viable and good choices, and these are knight fd7, knight d5, and g5. Knight fd7 would mean almost a direct transposition to the regular poison pawn, because in that line at a later stage black plays h6 and white goes bishop h4. So that would be a transposition to those lines. g5 is the extra option black has thanks to the inclusion of a6, and it is a reliable, solid line. However, the positions arising there are very complex and require quite and dangerous for black, I would say, even though objectively he's fine. And they require quite a bit of memorization. Therefore, the line I have opted for is the line with knight d5. I found this line to be relatively easy to play because play is forced, first of all. Quite a few pieces are exchanged along the way. And the positions are the least dangerous ones for black compared to the other two options. In short, it is the most difficult line to go wrong in. So, what happens here is that after knight d5, obviously the knight was hanging, knight d5, e5. Black has the positional threat of bishop e7 and short castling, where he would be winning, because apart from the material advantage, he also has the positional advantage with a better structure and better king. White doesn't have other choice but to push e6. Bishop e6. Why with the bishop? In order to force the exchange of the strong knight on d4. In most lines, black will lose the b7 pawn, but this will be compensated by finishing development. So bishop e6, knight e6, f e6, and now there is a choice, either bishop d3 or bishop e2. The good thing about black is that he reacts in the exactly same way against both moves. So let's check bishop e2 first, and now the typical reaction is bishop e7. So as you could see, black is aiming for exchanges. Black is aiming for exchanges. With every move, he's trying to exchange pieces. Now he wants to exchange the bishops. Okay, bishop h5, normal move. Otherwise, black would have castled. King d8. It is important. The king always ends up on d8 in these lines, where it is pretty safe behind the d5, e6 pawns. Soon enough, the knight will come to d7 after the bishops are exchanged, and as you may know, a knight in the vicinity of the king is the best defending square for that king, because it covers many important squares in the immediate surrounding of that king. So with the knight on d7, the king will be pretty safe. So after bishop e7, queen e7, short castle, the move to play is knight d7. So what do we have here? Black is still 2 pawns up. He finished development, and his only trouble is the king being stuck in the center. But this is not really a problem, because both rooks can enter into play, one via c8, the other one via f8. So normally why we castle? We castle in order to connect the rooks, so the rooks can come into play. But here the rooks can come into play without the necessity for castling. So the king can just remain in the center without impeding the development of the rooks, and also the king is quite safe in the center. Of course, some care is still required. Apart from being a good defensive piece on d7, covering the 7th rank and all these important squares, the knight can also become very active via, for example, f6, e5, c5, sometimes even b6 can all be possible options for the knight. But for the time being, white still has the initiative, and he takes on b7, returning 1 pawn. If white starts with rook f7, black reacts in the exactly same way, giving the check and getting away from the pin, and after king h1, now rook b8. Don't forget, black is always seeking for simplifications. Now the rook doesn't really have a choice, he must take, and after knight b8, we have a position where more pieces have been exchanged. Black had to pay for those exchanges by returning 1 pawn, but his position still remains very solid, being a pawn up, and with less pieces on the board, there is less danger of his king being subjected to an attack. Ideally, he would like to continue with rook f8, exchange even more pieces, the rooks, then the king will be even more safe. The knight will go back into play via c6 or d7, the king can go to c7 or e7, depending on circumstances, whether the rooks are exchanged or not. And even though the position continues to be tense, objectively black is doing quite all right, and I think practically the pressure is more on white, who is forced to come up with something to prove compensation for the pawn. Otherwise, black will consolidate, seek further exchanges, and just be much better thanks to his material advantage. The alternative here was not bishop e2 but bishop d3. The idea is the same, to give check, if not from h5 then from g6, and then continue in the same manner. As I explained, black's plays identical. Bishop e7, forcing exchanges, threatening short castle. White must give the check, king d8, the king goes to d8, of course, not on the f file where it will be shortly mated. Bishop e7, queen e7, short castle, and knight d7. Exactly the same, the difference being the bishop on g6. What black would like to do is go rook f8 and further exchange pieces. So let's now see what happens if rook f7 instead of the rook b7 line we saw in the other line when the bishop was on h5. Rook f7, of course, check, give a check, king h8 and rook f8, seeking exchanges. Yeah, very, very simple play for black, and this, as I explained, was my main reason for selecting this line for black. So rook f8, of course, white needs to avoid exchanges, so rook g7, and now rook f6. This is a very nice maneuver, rook f8, rook f6. Not only it kind of pins down the rook on g7 to the defense of the bishop on g6, but also creates the very nice threat of queen f8, hitting the rook on g7 and threatening mate on f1. A further idea for black here is to get the king out to c7 and allow the rook to maybe double on the f file. The position, of course, remains complex, but black is by no means worse, and again I feel white should be feeling here the pressure to prove compensation for the material deficit. So, the analysis of the three moves on move 11, e5, f5 and bishop f6 show us that black is perfectly well positioned for the ensuing complications, and we also saw the importance of the h6 move in the line with e5, because this line with knight d5 is a line that I think is the simplest one to play against the most direct attempt of e5, and one that also gives black a relatively easy play, as easy as it can get in the complications in the poisoned pawn or improved poisoned pawn. So now let's see what happens if instead of queen d2, so here instead of queen d2, white plays queen d3, which is the alternative way to sacrifice the b2 pawn. They're both pros and cons, as with everything with the move. From d3, the queen eyes the g6 square. This will become important later on. But on the other hand, the queen on d3 will be pinned, because after the queen, black's queen arrives to a3, the knight on c3 won't be able to move because an exchange of queens will happen. And second, the bishop on f1 cannot get to c4. These are the cons. But as always, it's all about the concrete move, so let's see how that works out in practice. Okay, queen b2, normal move, rook b1, queen a3. And now, as opposed to queen d2, where white had the wider choice, here he has only one serious attempt, and that's the move f5. The point being that e5, black can immediately take advantage of the position of the queen on d3 by playing knight e5. And now the queens will be exchanged. It's important not to take on e5, because after the exchange of queens, then the f file will be open for more activity for white. Therefore, e5, knight d5. This is an exception to what I just said, that d5 is more or less an automatic move because e5 can be attacked later on. But here, it is more important to keep the f file closed and exchange the queens as soon as possible. Therefore, f5. The same move as in the previous line, bishop e7 with the idea to castle, and after f e6, bishop e6. Again, let me explain the rationale behind taking with the bishop. Taking with the bishop is possible because after knight e6, f e6, the queen on d3 is impeding the move bishop c4, which would have been possible with the queen on d2, because therefore in that line with the queen on d2 we were taking with the pawn, keeping the bishop alive to defend e6. Here, since the bishop cannot come to c4, black uses the opportunity to exchange the centralized knight on d4 and force further exchanges. So white will take, and now white is further forced to be aggressive by playing e5, because if not, black will play knight d7, preventing e5 for good, and then will castle with excellent position, even if he's forced to return the pawn. He won't, because knight c5 will be a fork. But even if he is forced to return the pawn, he will have excellent position, because the small center e6, d6 provides excellent defense and also excellent squares for his pieces. The knight can come to the untouchable d5 square or to c5, then the other knight can be maneuvered to e5 or c5. The bishop may come out on f6 and so on. Therefore, white is forced to lunge forward by e5. e5, and now we see the idea of the queen on d3. Now you see that g6 is a sensitive square and the queen can give check from there. So d5, and now bishop f6. What is important to remember here, and just remember it as a fact. In case of a check on g6, the key move is not king f8, which may appear natural, but king d8. I know that it appears counterintuitive, putting the king on the open d file, not defending g7, but the justification is that the king will be very safe on the c file on the next move, king c8 or king c7 depending. The knight can come to c6 and cover it safely, because on the c file it cannot really be attacked because it's closed, and the knight on c3 is already hanging. So white does not really have time to capitalize on the king being temporarily on the open d file. So just remember that the king is walking towards safety on the c file and not on the f file. If white wants to keep the king on the king side, he must start with bishop f6. Now gf, taking with the pawn, connecting the pawns, creating a central mass and creating the positional threat of f5. Why is it a positional threat? Because it takes control of the light squares, controls e4, and effectively limits white's attacking potential, because the pawns are very strong in the center. So, bishop e2. The same rationale as before. Queen g6 should be met not by king f8, where the king can be vulnerable on the FL, but king d8. And then king c8, knight c6, and white doesn't have enough for the sacrificed material. Therefore, bishop e2. His idea is to give check on h5, the queen staying on d3, and preventing the march to the c file. So, bishop e2, and now f5. This was the positional threat. Yeah, f5, taking control of the light squares. Maybe there is an idea of e4. Black now wants to finish development, knight c6 or knight d7, the queen can come to c5. And if allowed to consolidate, he will simply be winning, as in all lines of the improved or regular poisoned pawn, because, as we said, black is not only materially superior, but he is also positionally superior because of his better pawn structure. So the only move to do something is to give the check, keep the king in the center, king f8, and now short castle. So white's compensation is, you could say, obvious, and not so obvious. Why obvious? Because, okay, the king is stuck in the center on f8, black still needs to finish development, some tactical tricks may appear, but if you look at it more concretely, white does not threaten anything concrete. The knight cannot move because the queens will be exchanged. There are no sacrifices on f5, most likely. Rook f5 needs to be checked, but black takes care of it on the next move. So how does white continue? b7 is hanging, and that is a threat. But again, with the next move, a very nice defensive move, rook h7, black deals with both no sacrifices on f5 and no taking on b7 because of the bishop c5 check, and the rook will be lost on b7. The moves queen d6 and queen c5 have been tried by some students, but I hope now you understand why rook h7 is the move to play here. It's good to keep the check on c5 in reserve, and also the rook move is a nice defensive move which prevents all sorts of sacrificial attempts by white. The rook, if required, can join the game via g7, so to be placed on the open file. So king h1, useful move, not only just automatically removing the king from the diagonal, but also reintroducing the threat of rook b7 because now there is no check on c5. Queen d6, winning a tempo by offering the exchange of queens to get the queen back to the defense. Again, white cannot take on d6 because after bishop d6 the rook on h7 defends b7, and in general white should be avoiding the exchange of queens. So queen h3, and now knight d7. Why on d7 not on c6? Because from d7 it wants to go to f6. It will cover the f file and also attack the bishop on h5. So again, objectively speaking, white does have compensation, but he must be very precise in how he goes about it, because if black consolidates, for example, knight f6, yeah, maybe the king will move to h8 and then the other rook can come to g8 and so on, then he will have a winning position. So the threat being knight f6, bishop g6 is a normal move because it forces the rook to move to g7, and then white will pick up the h6 pawn. So rook g7, queen h6, and now king g8. Some students have tried the knight f6 move, and it also is a possible move, most likely again ending in a perpetual check. But king g8 just appears, at least to me, more natural because it removes the king from the f file, still keeps the idea of knight f6, but also knight f8 or rook f8 with the idea of rook f6 may become possible. So white must be very direct here, and the best course here is to go knight rook f3, threatening rook h3 and mating on h8. Knight f6, now the threat is knight g4. Rook h3, the threat is mate, and now king f8. Now the king came back, but there are no threats along the f file, and the rook and the knight defend against any problems. Now best what white can do is to just start repeating. Rook g8, queen h6, rook g7 with a repetition. A note, if black is ambitious and wants to continue playing for more, he can play knight g8, but the position remains very complex and complicated, with black having all chance to come out on top if he manages to get the better out of the complications. From a theoretical perspective, it's enough to prove that black is at least not worse by forcing this repetition with a perpetual check. So the line with queen d3, at least according to our analysis, is likely to end in a perpetual check, showing that black theoretically is very much alive in that line. After testing these lines in practice, queen d2 and queen d3, and trying to go at black's throat in the most direct and violent means, white players concluded that black can hold there, and sometimes even more than hold. So they switched their explorations towards the main theoretical move, which is the move a3. Now the character of the play will be different. Different than the sacrificial lines, and more in line with what at least I consider to be a typical Najdorf. So both sides will finish development. white will go queen f3, long castle, the bishop will drop back to f2, then he will go g4, maybe h4 and so on. Whereas black will develop in the typical knight of fashion with bishop e7, queen c7, knight d7, and then push b5, bishop b7. For the time being, in the next several moves, play will be more... both sides will concentrate on their own development, and then when this development finishes, the more direct clash will start. It still pays to be careful with the move orders, so it's best for black to start with bishop e7. Why so? If you had paid attention, you will know that the move bishop e7 creates the threat of knight e4, therefore forcing white to do something about it. So bishop e7 and not knight b d7, which does not create any threat, and would allow white to develop the bishop actively on c4. So knight d7 allows bishop c4, but bishop e7 does not, because of the threat of knight e4. Bishop f2 is the main move, getting the bishop out of the harm's way and winning a tempo against the queen, forcing the queen to retreat. The move queen d3 is an interesting move, and it was played by Caruana in 2017 against Vachier Lagrave, and he, thanks to the surprise effect, he obtained an advantage. The move hasn't been repeated since, at least not in games worth taking into account. So I did my own independent research here, and I think I found a good way to deal with this line. It is important to note how black should play here, because play is a little bit different than the usual development here. So immediately on the first move, the knight does not go to the normal d7 square as in the knight, but goes to c6. Obviously black has many ways how to treat this position, but I kind of believe that the line which I'm about to demonstrate is the most effective and best one against Caruana's queen d3. So knight c6, immediately attacking the knight. Note that all the endgames, for example after long castle and queen exchange on d4, are favorable for black, as typically Sicilian endgames are favorable for black because of the compact position and no need to worry anymore about the king. So bishop f2, queen c7, dropping back, long castle, and now bishop d7. Like I said, play is a bit different. We don't have the normal development knight d7, b5, bishop b7, but instead we have more rouser-like, you could say, development of knight c6 and bishop d7. Some students have been impatient by playing b5, but this is not very good at this moment, because after knight c6, queen c6, bishop e2, the bishop will come to f3 and black will be vulnerable on the long diagonal. Once you know this, then you can easily remember and understand why bishop d7, because bishop d7 prepares b5. So after knight c6, he can take on c6 with the bishop. Rook g1. A logical move. White is trying to push g4, g5 and start attacking, but black's attack is faster after b5. Why is black's attack faster? Thanks to this little move a3. This creates a point of contact on b4, and after black pushes b4, his queenside play becomes very, very fast, because the king is already there on the queenside, whereas white's kingside play is very, very away from creating something, because the king is in the center, so it's more difficult to get to. So g4, and now the last, or the first of the two preparatory moves. First rook b8. So not rook c8 as some students have played, because the rook belongs on the b file. The threat is to push b4 and open the b file and then attack b2. So therefore rook b8, and not really g5, a common move in these structures, which we will see often in the subsequent analysis. No g5, because here it's positionally sound move by all means, but here it is simply more important to start his own counterplay by rook b8 and playing b4. It is just faster and better. So rook b8, queen f3, and now queen b7, the last preparatory move. It is tempting to play b4, which some students have tried. It is logical, understandable, but the move won't get away. And since white is not threatening anything, it's better to prepare it by queen b7. After b4, there will be an immediate threat against the b2 pawn. So this makes it even more dangerous for white. Black's initiative is quite menacing after b4, whereas white still hasn't managed to do anything on the king side. g5, for example, after capture hg, fg, would allow the e5 square forever to black. And the knight from e5 is a very useful attacking piece. It can come to c4. After b4, the b file will be opened, and black's initiative will be very, very strong. So therefore, this is why I think I managed to find a very good response to Caruana's very interesting novelty at that time of queen d3. So going back to bishop f2, the main move. Now play follows normal development, queen c7, obviously dropping back to the natural square. So queen f3, and now knight bd7. I was surprised that some students have tried other moves here, for example short castle, which looks outright bad because g4, g5 is coming, and as in the previous example, as we saw, the pawn on h6 as the pawn on a3 creates a point of contact on g5, which enables the attacking side to more quickly open the lines against the king. So therefore castling is just bad, and as a rule of thumb, it doesn't really black doesn't really castle short in this line of the Najdorf. b5 perhaps possible, but I would say a bit premature. And knight c6 not quite in line of the development we are trying to achieve here. Therefore knight d7, the typical Najdorf development for black. Knight bd7, short castle, long castle, and now b5. The last piece to be developed is the bishop on c8. Probably by some confusion, some students have tried to move knight c5, but that's premature, because black must first try to finish development by putting the bishop on b7. After bishop b7, black will have finished with the harmonious development of his pieces and will be ready to start play either in the center or the queen side. g4, the normal move for white. His plan is obviously to force through g5 if possible and start attack on the king side, but also indirectly in the center. And bishop b7, the final move for the to finish the development. And now we are at a crossroads. White has a choice here. The choice is between the moves h4, threatening g5, or bishop g2. White will try to force open the play because he's fully developed, and the black's defensive resources here are based on two ideas. One is the move g5, the positionally desirable move, because it will dislodge the pawn from f4, whether by forcing it to exchange on g5 or pushing f4, f5, or allowing the exchange of g5 take f4, which will give black the eternal square e5 for the knight. I remember back in the early 90s, I was at my first and only training camp in my life with the junior Macedonian team at that time, and we had a guest grandmaster at that time, Alexander Belyavsky, and he had unfortunately just one session with us, and as it happened in that session, we analyzed one game of mine, which I won in the Najdorf against another player from the junior team. And in that, what I remember from that session is that with the knight on e5, I remember that black was able, we analyzed really deeply for many hours that game, and with the knight on e5, black was able always to parry all the threats white created against the king. In that game, I had a short castle, but with the knight on e5, all the defense was somehow working out. So the only thing remembering from that training session is still valid today. A knight on e5 is almost a guarantee for a relatively safe life for black against any possible attacking attempts. Therefore, this is the importance of the g5 move. Once understood this, then of course you understand why white is playing h4, yeah, to prevent that move g5, which the move bishop g2 allows. So let's take a look at both. Bishop g2, finishing development, yeah, and now again, if allowed, he will further play h4s. Therefore, black is playing g5. I explained the benefits of this move g5, and therefore you understand why it should be played now and not moves like rook c8 or knight c5. So g5, winning the fighting for d5 square and eventually winning it. h4 is the most critical move. The point is that even though black will win the e5, black will force through g5 and dislodge the knight from f6. If, for example, f5, yeah, then not knight e5, because the pressure on e6 would be too much to handle, but e5. And in this relatively closed position, after knight b3, rook c8, black has excellent play, because white's kingside play came to a standstill, whereas black hasn't even started his own on the queenside. Ideas like knight b6, knight c4, or knight a4, sometimes bishop c6, a5, b4, and so on, are all on the table for black. So with typical rich queenside play for black, whereas white doesn't have anything concrete on the king side. Two important things. The first one is the immediate one, the tactical one. The threat is to take on e4. The point being that the knight on c3 cannot move because of the threat of mate on c2. So knight e4 or bishop e4 are a threat. And the second, more strategic move is that on the next move, black should play the move h5. Why? Because h5 effectively prevents white from playing h4. Because h5 attacks g4, so white should do something about it. And this will prevent white from playing h4 and perhaps taking on g5, opening the h file and using it to his advantage. Therefore, after g5, white's only realistic attempt to do something is the move h4, played by Karyakin against Vachier-Lagrave in a game from 2017, and the game we will be following. So g4, the natural move, obviously, black established or rather obtained his strategical objective by winning the e5 square for his knight. g5, that was on the other hand white's idea, so he did concede the e5 square, but is opening up the game on the king side. So knight e5, winning a tempo, queen f4, and now black has a choice. We will follow Vachier's choice of hg5, but it's worth noting that the alternative knight fd7 also has its positive sides. The main one being that for the time being the h file is kept closed, and this in a way slows down white's play on the king side. So it is possible to play knight f7, but following Vachier and his idea to exchange the rooks, that to a certain extent helps black, because that rook would be rather passive if stayed on h8, and also the point being that after hg, rook h1, knight fd7, the knight from d7 effectively defends black's king side, because it can drop back to f8, not only to prevent checks from h8, but also to prevent ideas like g6. So the next move can very well be knight f8, covering e6, covering g6, covering the 8th rank, and then if possible, black can consider long castle, or can consider leaving the king in the center and starting counterplay, something like queen a5, rook c3, maybe organize some b4, etc. Apparently the position remains very complex, as a lot of pieces have remained on the board, and white, we have to acknowledge, white does have tactical ideas based on knight d5, knight f5, knight e6, bishop h3, sacrifices on e6 and so on. So black needs to be careful, but objectively speaking, black is doing quite alright in this very complex middle game position. So after bishop g2 was proven to bring white no advantage, attention switched to move h4, which prevents the g5 thrust. And now knight c5. Since white is threatening g5, black is playing knight c5, attacking e4, winning a tempo. Students have tried other moves here, and for example, the move d5 is very interesting. So one I have not really analyzed. But the move rook c8 is outright bad because it doesn't do anything about the threat of g5. So after g5, black is close to lost, because the knight doesn't have a good square to go to. So d5 is interesting, but knight c5 will also continue with d5. The point of knight c5 being having further control of the e4 square. So after after d5 e5, the knight from f6 will come to e4. Since e4 is hanging, the next move is forced, bishop d3, and now black has a choice. Black has a choice of two principally different moves here. Both have been played by Vachier-Lagrave with success, and having a choice between one leading to crazy complications requiring deep theoretical knowledge and analysis, and another one based more on positional factors and the slower play gravitating towards the endgame. I chose the latter simply because I thought it's the practically more sensible choice. The moves in this position at black's disposal are d5, basically winning the e4 square, and the move h5, which also deals with the g5 threat, the point being that after g5 the knight can go to g4. This is what happened in the game Grischuk-Vachier-Lagrave. The game ended in a draw, but along the way there are possible improvements for white, where very often white plays rook hg1 and rook g4, sacrificing in exchange and then pushing through with f5 with a fierce attack. Objectively speaking, black is doing alright. He's not losing by force, not by far. But the lines are very, very complex and require quite a lot of memorization and analytical work. Therefore, I chose the move d5. Again, note that black does not have time for a move like rook c8 because g5 again crashes through on the king side. Therefore d5, and after e5, knight e4. So this is normally it is considered that black is doing great if he manages to push through d5 and then even put a knight on e4. This is also the case here, but white has the one factor going for him, which is the already advanced pawn mass on the king side, which he can further perhaps use to gain space there. However, with careful play, black is doing quite alright here, and an additional factor for my choice of this line is that black's king is perfectly safe in these lines. So whenever, if there is any danger, the king will be quite safe on the queen side after long castle, for example. And now bishop e4. If white plays something like bishop e1, okay, for the time being not exchanging the knight in the center, then black can go long castle. And then he will go king b8, rook c8, and he will continue with his queenside play. Well, whatever that means, like queen b6 it can be some exchanges, pushing b4, preparing b4 by a5, b4, then going bishop a6, exchanging the passive bishop and so on. So even though his king will be on the queen side, he will continue queenside play, where he's better positioned for active play, whereas white's advanced pawns on the king side will be rendered rather useless. So bishop e4, knight e4, and now rook h3. The idea of rook h3 is to use the third rank for the time being to defend against the possible doubling of the pawns after the exchange on c3. For example, if bishop e1 now, apart from the idea of long castle, there is an additional idea now with the c file being open, and that is the move queen b6. So the bishop abandoned the g1 a7 diagonal and the queen immediately takes over. The idea is to go rook c8 and then maybe even put a rook on c4. With the rook on c4, the bishop on e7, b4, a5 are all ideas for further attack on the queen side. So rook h3 and now rook c8. Again, this is not just an automatically putting the rook on the c file. It also introduces the idea I just mentioned. In case the bishop leaves the g1 a7 diagonal, the maneuver is queen b6 followed by rook c4. This also explains why black should not really take on c3, because that is what white prepared for by playing the move rook h3. After knight c3, queen c3, queen c3, rook c3, the rook will be already on the open file. The strategic danger black runs in these positions is that he ends up in some bad French endgame, because the structure basically is one from the French defense, obviously a favorable French defense, but nevertheless the bishop on b7 is passive for the time being, and if for example white manages to establish some sort of a grip, maybe by putting b4 and then boxing in the bishop on b7 forever, because black would like to go, for example, a5, b4 and bishop a6, activating the bishop like that. If white manages to avoid all this and contain black's counterplay, he will obviously be in a strategically winning position. Thankfully, this will not happen because it's pretty far-fetched, and if black is precise in the following next moves, he will obtain very, very good play. Therefore, first rook c8. Rook c8 and now queen e2. So the queen is removed from the third rank, so now in case of black threatened to take on c3, to exchange everything on c3 and ruin the structure and take on a3 eventually. So what white is doing is defending the knight on c3 with the rook. And now queen c4. Black is welcoming the endgame because in the endgame he will have very active pieces. Not only the knight on e4, but also the rook on c4. And also in case of an exchange on e4 and d4, the bishop on b7 will no longer be passive because it will have the excellent d5 square. Some students have tried to take on c3 immediately, but that sort of plays into white's hands, because that is exactly what white is preparing for with queen e2. If knight c3, rook c3. Whereas the move b4, which has also been tried by some students, is an interesting one. No? Okay, let me just demonstrate. Okay, b4, ab, queen, bishop b4, which puts more pressure on the knight. But then after bishop e1, it's again not entirely clear how black should continue. Quite possible to play like this, though I still prefer the more straightforward way of queen c4. Okay, the black wants to exchange queens, and after, for example, knight e4, d4, queen c4, rook c4, the endgame is excellent for black. The bishop will come to d5, plugging the d file, and then he still has active possibilities on the queen side. For example, he can go king d7 to allow the rook from h8 to join the game, to c8, to b8, depending where. If required, then the king can drop back to e8, and on the queen side he can start maybe push b4 or sometimes a5, a4, then b4, and so on. So the endgame is at least equal for black, where, okay, if white is not careful, he may even end up in some danger. This concludes our analysis of the traditional main line bishop g5 in the Najdorf. And I hope I have managed to pinpoint, describe, explain the critical moments, the typical reactions, also explain the forcing lines and the logic behind them. And I hope that this analysis proves reliable enough and hopefully easy enough to memorize, understand, and also eventually play, so that enables you to obtain very good and good counter-attacking positions in the line with bishop g5. Thanks for watching.